Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning back in. This is We the People. My name is Brett Maurer. I'm the host of this podcast. So, last week we discussed a gentleman by the name of Salem Poor. Salem Poor was a slave who was able to purchase his own freedom, and then, after purchasing his own freedom, went on to serve in the American Revolution and basically become an unsung hero of the revolution for his actions. So I wanted to kind of continue that idea of people who are not as well known to history as others being brought into the light. And I'm basing whether these people are kind of given the credit they deserve in American history based on textbooks from basic public schooling education, okay? And obviously every textbook is different. All textbooks have different, layouts and criteria and different things like that. And so what they discuss is even going to be different. But some of the inconsistencies that I've seen are shared between many different textbooks. And I just kind of wanted to address that. So, the person that I have selected for today is known in history, and he is known by historians. But many just normal public school kids and many adults don't actually know who he is. Many of you will know what he has said because he has an extremely famous line. His famous line is, "Give me liberty or give me death." And I'm sure some of you hearing that know exactly who I'm going to talk about. And some of you are probably still going, yeah, I don't know who said that. I've heard it before, but I don't know who said it. So the man we're going to talk about today is Patrick Henry. All right. Patrick Henry was a very influential American patriot during the Revolutionary period. And like I said, historians know who he is. Some textbooks talk about him, but a lot of people don't know much about him. Okay? He's not a household name like Paul Revere. You could probably walk into any house, any normal family in America and ask them, who is Paul Revere? And they would probably give you some line from Paul Revere's Ride, or they would tell you, like, oh, he's the guy that said, the British are coming, or it's, something like that. I think when I've asked that question, the most common response I've received is always, um, the first line from the Longfellow poem Paul Revere's Ride. And anytime I've asked someone, oh, do you know who Paul Revere is? A lot of times I get, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive, And it's either that or, oh, he's the guy that rode around and yelled the British are coming. And, he's a household name. You could go into probably any house in America and ask them who FDR was, or JFK, or George Washington. These are big household names. Everybody knows who these people are. But I would put money on it that if you asked 10 random households if anybody in that house knew who Patrick Henry was, you would maybe get one or two that told you yes. Okay? A lot of people don't know who he is. A lot of people don't know what he did. All they know is give me liberty or give me death. So, just some backstory on him first and foremost. He was born on May 29th in 1736. Now, that date is kind of disputed. I have been researching it a little bit, and many people say different things in different articles or different books. Some say it was May 18th that he was born. Some say I've seen May 20th, but it seems like the general consensus is May 29th. So that's the date I gave you. So May 29th, 1736, in Studley, Virginia, Patrick Henry was born as the second child of 9 to the Henry family. Now, some of you probably, when I say it was a family of 9 children, which means it was a family of 11, you're going, wow, 11 mouths to feed. I can't believe that. And a lot of people are shocked because of how large families were. And a lot of people just say, oh, that's what they did back then. Families were just big. There's actually reasoning for that. Okay, and there's 3 reasons that I like to basically give everybody as a general consensus. The first is that a lot of people were farmers during this time period, okay? You needed hands to work your farm. If you couldn't afford to buy slaves or you couldn't afford to hire people, well, kids were free labor. So you would have kids and they would feed the horses or the cows or pull weeds or, whatever they had to do. My second reasoning is that there was not any form of contraceptive, okay? You're going to have a lot more kids. But the third reason, and I think this reason is a lot, the word I'm looking for I can't seem to think of, but I think a lot more people would agree with me when I say they had larger families because children were less likely to live. Okay. If you were an adult in the 1700s, it was because you were probably one of the strongest of your flock. Okay, you were one of the strongest of the kids in your household. Because, one, kids do have less developed immune systems than adults. Okay, that's general knowledge. Adults have been exposed to more illnesses, to more germs, things like that. And if they come over it, and they become kind of immune to it. Kids, however, were less likely to come over it because they are being exposed to these germs and viruses and things like that for the first time. And while they had stronger immune systems, because they were younger, their body had more energy and more healing capability, they were still not as developed and were very susceptible. And this led to mass amounts of child mortality, which is just kind of something that we assume for, these time periods. We assume that there was large amounts of child mortality. We assume that, maybe a lot of mothers died in childbirth or things like this. And it's just what happened. And so those are my 3 reasons as to why I feel there were larger families during these time periods. And there's other reasons, obviously a lot of different cultures. It's kind of part of the culture to have large families. I have myself Lebanese and Syrian family members. My grandmother is half Lebanese, half Syrian. And that entire side of my family, they have very large families. And it's just kind of part of their culture. It has been forever. As far back as we know our family goes, it's always been large families. I have some friends that are Greek. I have some friends that are Italian. And a lot of them will tell you that they have extremely large families. And it's the same thing. It's just kind of built into the culture. And it was very similar for the English culture in like the 1700s. I don't know if that culture has changed now, but at least I can look at America and say we have changed. The American culture is no longer to have large families. Okay, and that's blatantly obvious. You can walk into a grocery store and see that. I mean, how many times have you walked into a grocery store and seen an episode from Cheaper by the Dozen? You know, it's, you never see it. You may see a family of maybe 5, and you're probably going, oh my gosh, they have 5 kids. Oh my gosh. But you've never, I would put money on it, seen parents with 9 kids. Okay, you've heard of families that big, but you've never seen them with your own eyes. But it was more common then. It's not that common now. And so obviously the culture has changed. So Patrick Henry was the second born of 9 children. Just like his siblings, he received a lot of his schooling from his father. His father was I guess the term I would use is college man. He was an educated man who was educated at universities in Scotland. His father was Scottish. We talked about that. And his mother had a little bit of wealth on her side of the family. And I say a little bit because I don't want to say that he was wealthy. Patrick Henry was not, John Hancock. John Hancock was considerably wealthy. Patrick Henry was well off, okay? He did grow up on a plantation that was owned by his mother's family with his 8 other siblings and his parents. They were raised Anglican, okay? They were followers of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. His uncle was actually an Anglican minister. All of the sources that I've read have said that he was a very musical child, but that he was also an amazing, persuasive, and passionate speaker, even at a young age. Obviously, he goes on in his adult years to be a persuasive and passionate and just emotion-filled speaker. But even at a young age, he was the same way. One of my sources says that at any given time, you could find him playing either the fiddle or even the flute, and that he also may have modeled his speaking skills on the religious sermons that his uncle and his uncle's, let's say, colleagues would have presented. So he designed his entire speaking pattern. He designed the entire way he presented himself and gave his information and his passion, how it was delivered. He designed all of that based on his uncle and his uncle's colleagues when they delivered their sermons in church. his mother was extremely religious. Okay, she was a major follower of the church. His father, having been Scottish, many sources, although no one has really focused on it a lot, many sources assume that he was Catholic, considering that was the common religion of many Scots at the time. And so many times he would go with his mother to church and hear his uncle speak. At about 15, as the story goes, Henry at the time was running the family store with his father. Okay. He grew up on a plantation, but the family did not always run the plantation. They ended up opening a store. But that store didn't last. Okay. At the age of 15, that business went under. And that is when a lot of people say Patrick Henry experienced his first failure in life. And he hated it so much that he strove for it never to happen again. And that's kind of, I feel like that's kind of a generic story. And maybe that's exactly what happened. Maybe it's not. I don't know, because I obviously wasn't there. All we can do is look at firsthand sources and look at other historians' research and gather our own opinions based on those facts. But that's how the story goes. The story goes generically, as many historical figure stories do, that he experienced failure and vowed that it would never happen again. But it was also around this time that he met his wife. So he met the daughter of a local innkeeper, Sarah Shelton, and married her in 1754. And at this time, it was still common for a woman to have a dowry. Part of his wife's dowry was Patrick Henry received some farmland. And so, for about 3 or 4 years, he tried his hand at the major cash crop of the English colonies. The one thing that the English found and they clung to for dear life, and that was tobacco. Okay? When England came to America, they wanted gold, they wanted silver, because that's what the Spanish were finding in Mexico. That's what the Spanish were finding in South America. That's what the Portuguese were finding in South America. But they didn't find that. No, they found wilderness. They found lumber. Okay, they found pelts and animals. And most importantly for them, they found tobacco. And so Patrick Henry tried growing tobacco. And he kind of failed again. And, it took a major toll on the family. But a few years later, so he married in 54 and received this farmland, 1754. For about 3 or 4 years, I would push to say probably more 3, he grew or attempted to grow tobacco. And then in about 1757, the farm burned down. There was a fire and the farm burned down. That was when Patrick Henry went to work in a tavern for his father-in-law. And he started going to school to be a lawyer. And that was the moment that his life changed. Okay, and the reason I say that is because I hate discussing hypotheticals. Anyone who knows me personally, I will tell them that all the time. I despise hypotheticals because when you work with history, there is no hypothetical. What we work with has already happened. The information is there, it is plain. You have to interpret it sometimes, but it doesn't change the outcome. Okay? We can't really speak in hypotheticals. But in this case, the hypothetical that I regrettingly discuss is he's lucky the farmhouse had burned down. Because based on the different sources that I've read, he had denied multiple times to work for his father-in-law in the tavern, saying that he was going to make it big with tobacco. And had the farm not burned down, he probably never would have gone to work at the tavern and never have been pushed to get his law degree. And his law degree is what carried him into becoming the ardent patriot in our uprising that he became. So he did study to be a lawyer, and he got his law degree and his license in 1760. As a lawyer, Patrick Henry developed a reputation, okay, as being a powerful and persuasive speaker, especially with a lawsuit case in 1763. Okay, this was known as the Parsons case. Basically, the Virginia colony had passed a law, and this law changed the way that church ministers were paid. And it basically caused ministers to lose quite a bit of money. So then when King George III, obviously the English king at the time, overturned the law, a Virginian clergyman sued. Okay, he sued basically for damages and restitution. He just wanted money back. He ended up winning his case. But this is when Patrick Henry got his reputation for being powerful and persuasive. He spoke out against the minister. Okay, he spoke out against the minister when the case went to a jury to decide the damages. He pointed out the greed and royal interference in colonial matters associated with the legal decision. And he managed to convince the jury to grant the lowest possible award to this minister. That award was a penny. Okay? This minister received a single penny. And the jury went with it. Patrick Henry won his, to say he won his case, but he won his case. He put a case together saying that this man should only receive one penny, and he convinced the jury. A couple of years after that, he went on to win an election. And he was elected into a position that basically rocketed him into colonial politics. Through this, he proved to be kind of an early voice of dissent against the British policies. And specifically, he kind of was portrayed as this image of dissent when there was a debate over the Stamp Act. And for those that don't know, the Stamp Act was a parliamentary act that was passed in 1765, I believe, that basically said any goods that you purchase, and this included legal documents and paper goods, cards, dice, anything, you had to pay a tax to get it stamped. And he spoke out against it. He spoke out against this measure heavily. Because it's, once again, going back to the idea of no taxation without representation. Okay? What that means is that unless the English crown was going to receive the input of, the elected officials of the colonies, or they were going to put representatives from the colonies on Parliament, they shouldn't be allowed to tax them, because they were taxing them without any form of legal representation from these established colonies that had their own central governments. So James Otis had spoken out when he said there can be no taxation without representation. He said taxation without representation is tyranny. And Patrick Henry, we see, spoke out also against the Stamp Act. He spoke out and said, this is not right. Okay? He insisted that the colony itself should be the only one able to levy taxes on its citizens, because that was the representative body of the colonies that was elected by colonists. They should be the only ones that could tax quote unquote American citizens. Some in the assembly didn't like that, and they told him that his comments were treasonous, and that never shook him. He remained unfazed by that, and he continued his fight. His suggestion for handling this issue was printed and distributed into other colonies. Okay? He basically wrote a pamphlet and had it mass produced with printing press and distributed all across the colonies. And basically what that did was, it was similar to Common Sense by Thomas Paine. It sparked just growing amounts of discontent with the British monarchy and British rule. So then, moving on, obviously a few years later down the road, we will see the Continental Congress form. Patrick Henry became an active force in the growing rebellion against Britain. And basically, he had this ability to translate political ideology into an understandable language for everyone. The easiest way I can kind of explain this or compare it is, everyone at some point has had that one teacher or that one professor, or maybe even a family member, who you didn't understand something that is commonly very difficult for people to understand. Okay? So, for example, I myself, and I know a lot of my colleagues and peers, struggle to sometimes interpret different historical writings because of how different the language structure is, or even sometimes we struggle to read laws and bills and things like that that come out of government. And that's even today in the modern realm because of the way the language is laid out, the way everything's worded. Sometimes you need the help of a professor or another person to kind of put that into the common tongue. And that's what Patrick Henry could do. Patrick Henry could take these complex and well thought out political ideologies from these educated kind of revolutionaries at the time. Okay, we always talk about like Adam Smith and his accounting and economic beliefs, or even like John Locke or Montesquieu or Voltaire. We talk about all these Enlightenment philosophers and things like this that created these texts and these ideologies and these ideas that were so complex but so enlightened and educated and well informed that a lot of times people had issues understanding them. Okay? It's like when you have that one cousin or a friend who's so smart they struggle to explain themselves. And that's exactly what it was. These guys were so smart that sometimes when they wrote, a lot of times when they wrote, people couldn't understand what they were trying to say. And Patrick Henry just had the tongue and the ability to be able to read these and basically spit the information back out for any common farmer in Massachusetts to understand, or any common farmer in Virginia, or tavern owner in New Jersey. Okay? And this made him extremely popular. And eventually he was selected to serve as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Okay, and the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774. This is the Continental Congress that decided whether they were going to go to war or not. Okay, this is the Continental Congress where Sam Adams and John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin all tried to push and convince their colleagues to give George Washington the troops he needed, the support he needed to fight Britain. And this is where Patrick Henry met Sam Adams. Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, in this single Continental Congress meeting, combined their mental forces and stoked the fires of revolution. During the kind of proceedings of the Continental Congress, Patrick Henry did call for colonists to unite in their opposition of British rule. And his probably most well-known quote outside of "Give me liberty or give me death" is his quote that kind of set the idea that we are not separate states. We are not separate. We are one. We are a single nation. We are not each individual states. We are a nation of states, and we are one united nation. We are the United States. His quote was, "The distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." And that was a major line. That was a heavy line. And he dropped it right there on the Continental Congress. And so he went on to continue calling for action from the Continental Congress. And later on, about maybe a year later, he gave his most famous speech of his entire life. Okay. And he gave this speech as an attendee of the Virginia Convention. Now, some of you are probably going, Brett, what is the Virginia Convention? Okay. So, the Virginia Convention, how can I explain it, was kind of, it was an assembly of, let's call them delegates, okay? Basically, it was the Constitutional Congress, but only for Virginia. It was like the Virginia state legislature, okay? That's what we'll call it. So the Virginia Convention was an assembly of the Virginia delegates that were obviously elected. And in March of 1775, this convention met, and Patrick Henry spoke. The group, the convention at the time, was debating how to resolve the crisis it faced with Great Britain. Okay. Whether it was to be through force and war or through writing petitions and peaceful ends. Patrick Henry stood up in front of the convention and called for war. He sounded the call to arms. And his famous quote is, "Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And it was only a few months later, in April of 1775, so only actually a few weeks rather than a few months, that the battles of Lexington and Concord were fought and the American Revolution was started. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired and the war was underway. And Patrick Henry himself became the commander-in-chief of the Virginia forces. He ended up resigning from that post after about 6 months of holding it, because he wanted to focus on being a statesman. He wanted to focus on getting the state, not the colony, of Virginia established. He wanted to focus on getting the United States of America established. And so he went on to help write the Virginia State Constitution in 1776. He also won the election to be Virginia's first ever governor as a state that same year. As governor, Patrick Henry supported the Revolution in countless ways, including supplying soldiers and equipment to George Washington from the state of Virginia. He sent Virginia troops commanded by George Rogers Clark, who is another famous historical figure. And if you don't know his story, I encourage you to go and look it up. He has an incredible story. But Patrick Henry sent him and troops to drive out British forces in the Northwest. And he ended up winning 3 more terms as governor and continuing to aid the Revolution. After his third term as governor, Patrick Henry resigned from his post, and in 1779, he retired. He remained active in the political realm and ended up becoming a member of the state assembly. And then later on, in the mid 1780s, he decided he had had enough of retirement, ran, was elected, and served 2 more terms as the state's governor. Now, Patrick Henry was what we consider an anti-federalist. Okay. The Federalists were people such as Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, John Adams, okay? These were people that basically believed that the states should unite under a central authority. And so that is basically where we got the idea of having a federal central government. That came from the Federalists. Whereas anti-federalists believed that the states should hold the power. Okay? Anti-federalists opposed a lot of aspects in the Constitution because they thought that a stronger government would threaten the sovereignty of the states. And they felt that the states should be the ones that hold the power. And it was basically between the compromise that came from these two parties, from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that our Constitution and our way of government was born. So the Federalists got a national bank. They got national debt rather than state debt. They got national credit rather than single state credit. Okay. They got the establishment of central government for legislature, for the executive powers, for the court systems. And the Anti-Federalists got each state had its own government, and each county had its own local government. Each city had its own local government. And anything that they didn't put in the Constitution, the states got to decide. So they wrote down the laws that they wanted the entire nation to follow, the rights that they wanted the entire nation to follow. And if it wasn't in the Constitution, then they said, you know what? The states get that power. And that's what the Anti-Federalists want. And Patrick Henry was a strong, avid Anti-Federalist. Okay, he believed that a powerful federal government would basically lead to a similar form of tyranny like the one the colonists had basically just freed themselves from in Britain. He actually turned down an opportunity to attend the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Okay. His opposition to the Constitution did not waver. Even after he received the final draft of the Constitution from George Washington after the convention, his opposition to the document did not waver. When it came time for the state of Virginia to ratify the Constitution, Patrick Henry spoke out openly against the document, calling its principles extremely dangerous, because he felt that it would negatively impact the states' rights. And considering the strong support for Patrick Henry in Virginia, many Federalists feared that Patrick Henry would be successful in his anti-constitutional efforts. But in the end, the majority of lawmakers put Patrick Henry's beliefs aside and they ratified the document. The U.S. Constitution was ratified with an 89 to 79 majority vote. After that, Patrick Henry left public service. And in 1790, he actually retired once again from the political realm. He ended up becoming a lawyer again, and he established a very successful law practice. And over the years, for the remainder of his life, he had received numerous inquiries and appointments to positions for Supreme Court Justice, Secretary of State, Attorney General, and he never took any of them. He turned all of the appointments down. At this time, he was married to his second wife, since his first wife had died, and he decided never to go back into politics, basically because he enjoyed the time he could spend with his second wife, and obviously their children, and the children from his previous marriage. And he chose to focus more on family rather than on navigating the world of politics. He ended up being a father of over 17 children. 17 children. Patrick Henry had 17 children between two wives. Okay? 17 children. Can you imagine having raised 17 children? Now, obviously, he didn't raise them all in the same house. Okay, we know that. He had 6 children with his first wife, Sarah. But still, 17 children. Talk about leaving a legacy behind. Patrick Henry ended up spending the last few years of his life on his estate in Virginia. And before he passed, he was finally, once again, convinced to run for office in 1799. So in 1799, Patrick Henry got up off his couch. He went and ran for office. At this point, he had switched political parties and became a Federalist. As a Federalist, he was urged many times by his good friend, the President, George Washington, to run for the Virginia legislature. And he decided to do it. And so he ran as a Federalist for Virginia legislature, and he won the post. And once again, took a seat in the realm of politics. But he never actually got to serve in office. He ended up passing away before he actually took office and power on June 6th in 1799 at his Virginia estate. And I think the biggest reason why he's many times forgotten in history is simply because he never held national office. He was one of the founding fathers, and I strongly consider him a founding father. I'm sure there's some that would argue with me, but in my opinion, he is a founding father. There are some who would argue this, But I say the reason he is not remembered as much as other founding fathers is because he's one of the few that didn't end up holding some form of national office. Okay? Ben Franklin went on to hold national office, to hold international office. Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France. Then he was the Secretary of State. Then he was the vice president. Then he was the president, okay? Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. John Adams, Sam Adams, okay? All of the founding fathers at some point held a state office. Patrick Henry didn't. And I think that's a big reason why Patrick Henry is many times forgotten in our history. But he was such a driving voice in the call for revolution. He has to be remembered as one of the great revolutionary leaders. And I'm pretty convinced that he is, but he's still not known. And he's not held on this pedestal that the other founding fathers are. They don't make a musical about Patrick Henry. They made a musical about Thomas Jefferson. I've never seen a movie about Patrick Henry, but there's been movies about George Washington. There's been movies about John Adams, documentaries about Thomas Jefferson. Okay? And he was basically the voice, the overall most empowered voice for the American Revolution. And without his powerful speeches and his adamant call for revolution and freedom and rebellion, it can be strongly said that who knows if we even would have ended up going to war. Yes, we were on the brink of war, but the war would not have lasted had Congress not given George Washington troops. And again, I know we're speaking in hypotheticals, and I hate speaking in hypotheticals, but even with the troops that Congress was giving George Washington, the army struggled. Okay? I don't think it's an unfair point to bring up that a major reason we won wasn't because of George Washington. It was because of the French coming to our aid. George Washington was great. George Washington was smart, an excellent soldier. At least in the American Revolution, he was an excellent soldier, far better than he did in the French and Indian War. But the French are the ones that dug us out of the hole. The French are the reason we won. The intelligence that was set up is the reason we won. Had Congress not decided to go to war and give George Washington the extra troops, I don't think the American Revolution would have lasted past New York, past the New York campaign. I don't think the American Revolution necessarily would have lasted past the sieging of Boston. And it was Patrick Henry's voice and his push, along with obviously his matching with Sam Adams, John Hancock, the original kind of bad boy Massachusetts group that that kind of pushed for revolution to begin with, because obviously Boston was kind of the heart of the revolution. Had, without his partnership with them and him speaking out for revolution, without Patrick Henry, America would be a very different place. And yet he's not given the kind of honor that he deserves. in my eyes. I feel that he's very still unknown when he is a person who has every right to be a household name as much as Alexander Hamilton does, as much as John Adams does, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin wasn't even a president. Ben Franklin wasn't even a soldier. But he's a household name. He's got his face on money. And he basically did the same thing as Patrick Henry. He spoke. He passed legislation. He didn't fight. Sure, he held offices. He didn't hold a secretary position. And that's my point. On a playing field, looking back at history, in my eyes, Ben Franklin and Patrick Henry are equal. But I could walk into most households in America and ask them if they know who Ben Franklin is. And they would either tell me, oh, he's the dude on the $100 bill. Or, oh, he's the guy who invented bifocals. Oh, he's the guy with the key and the kite. Yeah, you know that. But do you know who Patrick Henry is? Probably not. So that's going to conclude today's podcast. I want to once again thank everybody for tuning in. I'm going to be posting hopefully again next week. The reason I say hopefully is I'm working right now with some video. I'm trying to figure out how to get some form of video kind of group Zoom interviewing going and seeing if I can format it right the way that I want it to make it work for a podcast. So hopefully next week you will see episode 3 for the history and for the politics section. But if you haven't already, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. If you'd like to leave a comment about a topic or a person or an event that you would like me to maybe cover or put into a group panel discussion, let me know. I'm going to be checking all of those. I have gotten some feedback in my private messages for different things, and I'm going to be lining up those different topics. So yeah, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Make sure to hit like. Reach out if there's anything you want to hear about. And make sure you go and check out that other video in the politics section. I'm going to be working on getting, like I said, the video put together and getting a discussion board panel put together. And we'll see how it goes in the future. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day if you're listening to this, and we'll talk to you soon.